Hey guys, I got a special guest here for 54 Bust, and coming off the back of a video I did just recently where we talked about catching fish in deep water, and listening to a recent podcast that my buddy Tyler Andrews did, and the podcast is called Not a Musky Podcast, and he had Dr. Bob Klindworth on it, or Klindworth, I'm sorry if I butchered his name. And it was really interesting listening to a biologist, or I think he's a physicist, talk about the biology and physiology of muskies, and not really being guided by working with a company, or not really having a background in musky fishing per se. So a lot of our fans asked me to reach out to a biologist, and Sean Landsman's name come up a bunch of times. So I thought, why not reach out to him directly? So we're very fortunate to have Sean on the channel here, and we have a pretty cool list of topics we're going to go through. I just want to put the caveat out right away. We're not going down the forward-facing sonar hole here. This isn't what this is about, but some of these topics do relate to that, and I do think that it's really interesting. So Sean, thank you so much for coming on the channel, and how about you introduce yourself and a little bit of your background and where you come into musky fishing.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I'm happy to be here. I mean, this is, as the kids say these days, this is my jam. I enjoy talking with people that are interested in muskies, that are also interested in the science behind muskies and musky fishing, recreational angling science. So I'm happy to be here for sure. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I live in Ottawa right now. I work at Carleton University as a teaching professor and fisheries researcher and science communicator. I wear kind of a number of hats. I have a small research program. I work pretty closely with Dr. Steve Cook, who some of your listeners may be familiar with that name. We do a variety of different research projects on different species, a lot of movement ecology related studies, including with muskies. And that's for sure like my passion species. 100%. Originally from Chicago, grew up fishing the impoundments and little river systems and subdivision lakes in central Illinois. I actually grew up about 2.5 hours south of Chicago. We didn't have a lot of musky water in the state of Illinois, but I had joined Muskies Inc. Back in 2001. And I think I caught my first muskie on a little impoundment in central Illinois in 2001. Actually, it was 2 days before September 11th. Never forget that. Yeah, I've been hooked like since.
It's a really cool story. I think a lot of us kind of get caught, so to speak, with the bug in the same way. It's for a lot of us, you look at muskies as that fish of, why would you bother trying to catch that? You can't keep it. It's not table fare. It's not, right. It's not a lot of things, but you catch one when you're actually trying to catch one. And it is one of those, it's like a life altering experience. There's something about holding the biggest freshwater fish. It's exciting. And that's the shared passion that so many of us have. And it is one of those things that you either have it or you don't. It's really hard to be on the fence with musky fishing. And I had recently listened to one of your podcasts you did. I think it was with Gord Pizer, and you guys talked a lot about the science. And I really like that approach. And I like the conversation that it opens up around musky fishing, because I think coming out of COVID, we've seen an increase in anglers, so there's an increase in pressure, and with it, there's an increase in new anglers, which a channel like mine and a lot of guys that are on YouTube and a lot of the musky, quote unquote professionals are trying to do a better job of, teaching conservation and musky handling. And I think something that gets lost in it is the science-based information. And again, it's such a cool conversation, and it opens up conversations at, the boat landings, at the bars, at the spots where guys get together. And I really think that stuff that you're doing, and Tyler having Dr. Bob on, it's a needed side of our industry. So I would say I'll start by asking you a question that I get a lot. We catch a lot of tiger muskies up in northwestern Ontario, and a lot of people ask us, how do you have so many tiger muskies? I think the general consensus, everyone knows it's a mix between that northern pike and a muskie. But can you tell us a science-based explanation of where it is they spawn together, the habitat, the timing? What do we need to get this hybrid spawning?
Yeah, it's actually funny you asked this question because I actually just caught a tiger the other day here around Ottawa, and I haven't caught one for over 10 years, and I actually hooked one in this same body of water earlier this year and lost it, and it felt like losing a 50-incher. Why? Because they are so rare. And so you just ask, you know, how do we get these tigers? What has to align? And the reality is that actually a fair amount of factors need to align for us to be able to get tigers in the first place. I think the relative abundance of tigers, you know, in some places like up your neck of the woods, you know, even like St. Clair, I mean, kicks out some huge tiger muskies and a fair number of them, and we're starting to see some of that in the Kawarthas too, with their pike invasion, quote unquote. And really, what has to happen is you have to have an overlap of northern pike and muskie spawning. So northern pike spawn shortly after ice out. They're one of the earlier spawners. But you know, like a lot of species in sort of these temperate latitudes, I don't, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but a number of species in these temperate latitudes have somewhat of a protracted spawning period, and that's a bit relative, right? So for example, like Florida bass, because we're now actually largemouth, this is sort of a tangent, but largemouth bass have now been split into two separate species. So the bass in Florida are now their own species. And those, one of the characteristics of Florida bass is that they spawn for a long time. Like their spawning season is much longer than they would be for the sort of the northern variety of largemouth bass. And you know, muskies, to give you a sense of their spawning range, typically between around 9 or 10 Celsius, so that's about 50 degrees, to about 15 Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So a pretty sizable window there, which on a calendar, you know, depending on an individual spring, could be kind of short, or it could be kind of long. Like if you have a cool spring where it takes a long time for the water temperatures to rise, those fish could be spawning for a month. Or again, if you have like a really warm spring, could be compressed down to, you know, a week or two. But it's not like we're talking like a day or two of spawning. That might be the case for some other species, but not really for pike and muskie. But going back to pike, they spawn early. But again, you'll have some individuals that will still be spawning kind of later in the pike spawning window. And it's those late spawners and say those first musky spawners, that's when you can get that overlap to occur. Okay, so that's the time overlap. You now need spatial overlap. You need them actually in the same place at the same time. Pike are generally pretty shallow water spawners. My understanding is that between pike and muskies can spawn a bit deeper than pike, but you will still have muskies spawning in very shallow water. You know, in fact, when people go out and do, you know, researchers go out and do spawning surveys, they're in, you know, a few feet of water, and in a lot of cases they're doing visual spawning surveys, so they have to be in shallow water. Can't necessarily be in 6-7 feet of water and be able to see a muskie down there. Can in some bodies of water, but not all. So as long as you've got that overlap in time, so the late spawning pike and the early spawning muskies, and they're in the same areas, then you can potentially get, you know, the ingredients for creating hybrids. I have never seen a pike and a muskie together before. Are they paired up together? You know, presumably they would be paired together. Okay. they're similar species, they're similarly shaped, and they fertilize the eggs. Or if it's a case of, you know, one's eggs are deposited on the bottom of the water body, and later or soon thereafter, you know, another individual comes along and drops their milt, and fertilizes the eggs, and suddenly you have, like, in my opinion, they're probably paired up, because I believe there's a very short window where those eggs can be fertilized. And to me, the most plausible explanation for getting hybrids is that you've got both species are pairing up together, as opposed to, you know, one just comes along and ends up like fertilizing eggs that are on the bottom. So I think there's a convergence of things that has to happen, and I think the propensity to get more hybrids than others comes down to the relative abundance of both species. So if you have a fairly high relative abundance of both muskie and pike, then I think you stand a pretty good chance of producing hybrids. If the amount of available, like, wetland or, you know, backwater habitat is somewhat minimal, it might force pike to choose locations that that muskie themselves might be using, as opposed to muskies going like way back into some of these backwater wetland type areas that pike might use. If there's less of that habitat, it forces the pike out to kind of the immediate margins of the lake, where you tend to see muskie spawning.
That's really interesting. We, on average, probably catch 10% tigers year to year. This year, actually, the last 2 years, we've seen an increase in tigers overall in the area, which to me lends itself to obviously a time in the past where we had that overlap and we had a very successful crossbreeding. So with a couple successful years of that crossbreeding, and I think we've always known it has to be like a very narrow window, and we can almost look back and see which spring where we had that protracted spring, and you might have had that overlap that way, or we can look back and you can see a spring where we had ice out and then it got 30 above and it warmed up super quick, and the pike are in there and the muskies push in so quick because the water goes from 38 degrees to 60 degrees inside of a week and a half. So cool. We do see that. But that leads me right into my next question. And something that we get asked a lot is, how old are our fish? When we're looking at natural muskies, Sean, and I'm going to say Northwestern Ontario, which I think is very similar to like the Kawarthas, maybe not similar to the Great Lakes, but what are we looking at for like growth rates for a regular muskie that's naturally spawned? What's it take for it to get to, 40 inches, 45, 50 inches, on average? And what's the difference in that hybrid or tiger muskie? Because we have photographic proof of year after year catching the same tiger muskie. And I'm going to include the pictures here where David caught one in 2017. It was 37.5 inches. The next year in 2018, the exact same fish was caught by a buddy. It was 41 inches on his bump board. And a year later in July, I caught the exact same fish and it was 43 inches on my bump board, actually just a tick under. So it was growing upwards of 2+ inches a year, and it was getting girthy. And then we actually had another picture from a camp owner that his guest claimed in October it was 46 inches, which I think that's a little bit of a stretch because I didn't see a bump board picture, but it's clearly growing at an exponential rate. And we see these fish in our lake, and the biggest tiger I've caught was 47, 48 inches. And we just do not see fish. When we catch them at 44, 45 inches, we rarely ever see that fish again. It's like their life expectancy just falls off a cliff, so to speak. So if you can kind of touch on that, like that, I wouldn't want to say life cycle, but the life, growth rates of some of these fish.
Growth trajectory. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm super jealous you get tigers that big. I mean, God, if I caught a 48, I think that would be the equivalent of like a double nickel if I caught a 48-inch tiger. That's just wild. And I've seen a bunch of your videos, and yeah, you guys catch a ton of tigers, which is wild. So I'll talk I'll see if I can actually answer both with a little bit of data. Okay, I pulled out some data from a paper by probably the most esteemed, certainly currently alive, musky pike scientist out there, Dr. Don Castleman. The other, probably the most esteemed would be Dr. Ed Crossman, but he's since passed. Now, Dr. Castleman, for those that aren't familiar with his work, one of his major contributions to musky science, musky and pike science, is part of something called the Clythrum Project. The Clythrum bone, okay, the Clythra is a bone, and the Clythrum is the singular of the bone. Clythra refers to both bones. These bones are on the outside of the gill plate. So if you ever go to like fillet a fish, you would usually start, you would make a cut from top to bottom of the fish. You're usually doing that right on the outside edge of the Clythrum bone. These bones can be read like rings on a tree. If you put them under a microscope with focused light, you can read rings on the bone itself. So he had collected a ton of these Clythrum bones from across the Muskies range. The caveat to that is, of course, that this was at a time when more muskies were being harvested, for food or for for being mounted on the wall. Today we don't really eat muskies as much. Certainly, as specialized anglers, don't typically do that. And people are going to replicas now. So the Clythrum project has started to kind of fall to the wayside. I don't think Castleman and anyone else affiliated with that project are getting a lot of Clythrum bones sent in. However, he does have some published data, and I actually went in and looked at the growth equations for two populations of female muskies, and I plotted it out on my computer here. And so I'll give you kind of a sense of how long it takes some of these female fish to grow. So in Lac Seul, right, it's one of the most famous musky lakes in North America. It's the only one that has a catch and release only regulation, thought to contain potentially world record class fish. Just an amazing body of water, certainly on my bucket list. A fish to reach about 40 inches of length, a female, would be between 8 and 9 years old, according to Dr. Castleman's data. Okay, on Lake of the Woods, which for many of your listeners probably are familiar with it, either just having heard of it or maybe have fished it yourselves. That body of water kicks out big fish for sure, but there are also lots of parts of the lake that contain smaller fish, right? It's kind of known as being a nice blend between an action fishery with trophy potential, as opposed to something like Lac Seul, where much lower density, but you can get some truly huge fish. So for a fish to reach 40 inches a female to reach 40 inches in Lake of the Woods, you're looking at, again, between about 8 or 9 years old. Now, you mentioned that Tiger Musky. You said it was in 2017, it was about 37 inches. Is that right? Or 35 or something?
It was 37.5, and then 1 year later it was 41, and then next year later it was 43.
Yeah. So that's pretty consistent with the data from these two populations and granted these are true muskies. But you're looking, so just to back up, fish have what's called indeterminate growth, meaning they will grow for their entire lives. But it's not like they grow at 2 inches every year of their life. They grow very rapidly when they're young, and then the trajectory starts to taper off. Okay, it sort of plateaus. It still goes up, but those increases later on in life, those increases in length, you might be only looking at like less than an inch per year. But the pattern you described, growing a couple of inches every year from 37 inches when it was first caught to 43 inches, was it like 3 or 4 years later, is pretty consistent with the information that I'm looking at on my computer here. Female muskie in Lake of the Woods, 35 inches, age 7, and then 38 inches the year later, like 1 year later, so about 3 inches. Then it's 38 inches at age 8, and by age 9, it's about 40 inches. So you're talking about 2 inches of growth, and then same for the next increment, and so on and so forth until we get to about age 13, when we start to see increases of about 1 inch or less. So, I think by the time a fish reaches about that low 40-inch range, beyond, that low 40-inch range, when we're getting to the, mid upper 40s and above, you're looking at a growth rate of about 1 inch or less per year. Certainly when they hit 50 inches, every year after that, you're probably looking at less than 1 inch of growth per year. Now, males will grow faster, but they top out at lower sizes, right? So like a 50-inch male would be an exceptional fish, whereas female muskies can grow much larger than 50 inches. The early years of growth, right? So a 1-year-old fish, after 1 year of life, it's about 5-6 inches. By year 2, it's 12 and a half inches. So it can double or more than double in length between year 1 and 2, and then you might get about 50% of that between age 2 and 3, but that still equates to like 6, 7, 8 inches of growth. Again, rapid growth at first, then it tapers off, and that pattern holds, like, again, for males and females across their range.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess because, and we do catch some of the same muskies year after year. And actually, just behind me right there, Sean, is a 45-inch tiger that comes from Cedar Lake. It's a lax replica. My wife caught the exact same fish. I caught it in July of 2019, and my wife caught it in October of 2018, and it was just under 43 inches. I caught it 8-9 months later on the exact piece of structure, and it was just a tick under 45. And I guess we probably do see it in some of the regular muskies that we do catch. And kind of to back up, when you said fish approach that 50-inch and they don't really change much, years ago up on Long-Legged Lake, northwestern Ontario, it's kind of right on the upper edge of the musky range. My wife's mother used to work there. I had caught a 49-inch fish, really nice, big, heavy fish. It had a distinctive cut in the dorsal fin. And 2 years later, some camp guests, friends of ours, caught it, and it was like 49 and a half, and it was the exact same fish. So it clearly was towards the end of life, where the end of its growth rate, or, it wasn't getting any bigger, wasn't getting any heavier. It was just kind of, maintaining. So yeah. I do think it's interesting that a lot of us now, with so many pictures we take, in my case, we take video. I keep a pretty detailed log of, the water temps, the air, excuse me, the air temps, wind, weather conditions, where we catch these fish. So like, I think a lot of anglers are starting to get a lot of data, but I just don't think that we really know what to do with it in a lot of cases, which is unfortunate, because I know scientists like you want data. Data is important. The next topic I wanted to kind of touch on, it's kind of getting... Yep.
Can I stop you for just a second? Because you brought up something that I think is really key in this discussion, and that is that us musky anglers, we have tons of data on our phones, and that data is our pictures, right? And what I would really love to see happen, particularly here in Ontario, is to actually be able to leverage all the data that us anglers have on our phones through our pictures, and be able to actually keep track of populations, especially in Ontario, of our muskies. And with advances in machine learning algorithms, you know, these neural networks that can identify patterns really quickly and then pull out, you know, an individual, or I'd be able to identify something as, you know, in this case could be tiger versus pike versus, you know, musky. I think there's the possibility that in the future, we will be able to monitor populations of fish like muskies, provided they have unique enough markings, just by being able to take photos and upload those to a database. And one of the things I've noticed in Ontario, and it, you know, it's no fault of, you know, the MNRs. It really has to do with the powers to be and allocation of resources, but there's no dedicated, there's no dedicated musky surveys that get conducted on a province-wide level like there might be in some of the states. And some of that has, I think, to do with the geographic extent of Ontario in particular. But it comes down to resources. And, you know, we have something like 300 water bodies, I think, in Ontario that have muskies in them. I could be mistaken on that, but it's a large number. And spread out, as you said, from Northwest Ontario all the way down to the far, you know, eastern corner of Ontario. And that's a huge geographic distance. What I would love to see is that we can use some of these developing technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to keep track of individual fish and their growth rates through time. We would be able to do that, you know, by taking pictures, uploading them into a database that the algorithm can then, you know, pick out as that is these 3 photos are the same fish. Then go, okay, the first photo in chronological order, the fish was this length and this length and this length. So I just wanted to sort of say that to encourage, I think, viewers to be asking questions like that. How could we use emerging technologies to better manage our fisheries resources? And there are some tools on the horizon. So just wanted to sort of put that out there, that push for that if you can, and I'd love to have discussions with anyone that, you know, might be interested in potentially funding an endeavor like that. There's a colleague of mine actually out in Western Manitoba doing some work with muskies in some very specific water bodies out there where they're actually trying to use some of you know, these algorithms to be able to keep track of fish in those bodies of water. So we're heading in that direction, and it's kind of exciting. So just wanted to throw that out there.
That is so exciting. I'm a little bit speechless because we get bombarded with AI and all the technology all the time, and a lot of times we think it's bad, but that's the first time I've ever heard anything along those lines when it comes to the science base. That's totally amazing. I would be so on board with a project like that. And you're right, the way the algorithms work, I'm sure that's, you know, it's easy to track some of these fish. And you're right, we have so many fish pictures nowadays. And when you take the angler out of it, and whether it's the ego, the lying, the whatever it is, it's like, oh, it was this on my bump board. When you hold a fish up and the algorithm can look at it and tell you exactly what those are, that again, that science base, that gives you real world data, where I think right back to the beginning of our conversation, Sean, those are the conversations we need to have as an industry. And because I work with so many of the great companies in the industry and talk to a lot of the owners and whatnot, they want to see that positive change. They want to see increased conservation. They also want to see an increase in anglers because it's good for business, but we need the muskies in the water for it to be good for business. So that's why I think these type of science-based approaches can really help. And one thing that I've talked a lot about is a lot of the information that we have as muskie anglers kind of comes from what I've called like the quote unquote old guard, whether it was like Joe Booker, Jim Sarek, Pete Mena, and it's nothing against those guys. They're legends. Steve Herbeck up in my neck of the woods. they've learned more and forgot more than I'll ever, hope to learn. But they're the ones that passed a lot of this information on to us, and a lot of it's been accepted for decades. And now with new science, like with what you're doing and other individuals, we're starting to see a slightly different picture on what the muskie's capable of doing and what we can do to protect it. And I'll segue into the next couple topics. They're the hot button topics, and it's one that gets talked about so often, and it's warm water. And Dr. Bob talked about it on the Not a Musky podcast with Tyler. And Northwestern Ontario, we don't really have to deal with that, whatever that hard line at 80 degrees that everybody in the musky industry talks about. We rarely get that. The odd time you do. And for us, we don't really approach it any differently. If it's so hot out that it's uncomfortable to fish, we're generally just not going to go fishing. So that's a personal thing. And I tend to think that the muskies, in a lot of cases, when the water's that hot, are pretty lethargic anyway, in my experience and what I've seen on the water. What science tell us? And maybe I'll do like a twofold question. The other part of that is this thought of barotrauma, or people catching fish in deep water, which they're saying is cooler down below, dragging these fish up into warm water. I know that's a loaded question, Sean, but it's something that gets talked about ad nauseum in musky fishing right now. And listening to you on the Gord Pizer podcast talking about it, it's just such a breath of fresh air hearing science-based approaches.
Yeah, maybe I'll tackle the barotrauma question first, because I think in a way it's easier. It'll take me less time to answer that one than the other, which is a lot more nuanced, or at least should be a lot more nuanced than the discussion often becomes, particularly online. Yeah, barotrauma. Here's the reality. Let me actually, before I say here's the reality, let me back up for a second and sort of give listeners a quick fish ecology lesson. So fish can be divided into, bony fishes can be divided into two groups based on their swim bladder structure, their swim bladder arrangement. One's called physoclistus. That's just a fancy way of saying like they have a closed swim bladder, okay? In contrast to what's called schizostomous fish. These are fish with an open swim bladder, meaning that there is a small little duct, a little channel that connects the swim bladder to the esophagus, and thus, because the esophagus is exposed to the outside world, okay? So those kinds of fish have the ability to, for example, expel gas out through their mouths. Okay, think lake trout, famous for, you hook them from deep water, you're bringing them up, and there's like bubbles coming up, right? That's them expelling gas out of their mouth, and it's coming up as bubbles to the surface. Similarly, those fish can come up and actually gulp air from the surface. Now, those that have that closed swim bladder cannot do that. The only way they can regulate their swim bladders is through gas exchange. It's something called the gas gland. There's a complex network of veins and blood vessels and capillaries that are kind of attached to the swim bladder, and there's gas exchange, there's things going into the swim bladder and things coming out, and it's a complicated process. And what happens with those kinds of fish, and those kinds of fish would be walleye, perch, smallmouth bass, okay, crappie. If you bring them up from depth too quickly, the gas inside the swim bladder, it expands too quickly. They can't let some of that gas go as they're being yanked to the surface in 10 seconds from 50 feet down. And when that happens, you get all sorts of changes that can happen to the body. Hemorrhaging inside, you can get, gas bubbles that leak out into the bloodstream and then, cause embolisms. You can get eyes that pop out. The swim bladder can expand so rapidly that it actually pushes the stomach out of the mouth. You can get, the anus like protrudes. I mean, it's just gnarly for the fish. Muskies are in that schizostomous group, that group with that open swim bladder. So it's got that little connection from the bladder to the outside world. So it's not to say that muskies do not experience barotrauma, but they will, if they experience it, they'll be less likely to experience it than a fish that has that closed swim bladder type, something like a walleye, a smallmouth bass. But again, it's not that they just don't experience it. They can experience it. It's just that the likelihood that they experience the really negative impacts of barotrauma, or even some of the milder symptoms of barotrauma, which can just be like, a fish at the surface is kind of like bloated a bit and it's sort of listing back and forth, are reduced for fish like muskies. Now, that said, again, there's the potential for them to experience that. So, and I've talked to some really accomplished anglers that have said, look, I've caught them out of 8 feet of water and they're displaying symptoms of barotrauma. They're bloated, they're listing at the surface, they're unable to kind of regain their equilibrium, and that, that's concerning, because then what that tells me is, well, is there any safe depth for them? No, I think there generally is kind of like a safe range that we can fish for them. I'd probably say, I get twitchy if I'm, jigging like a Bondy bait and I'm coming down a ledge and I'm going from, 20, 25 and I hit 30, I'm starting to get a little twitchy there at 30, and may turn the boat a little bit and head back up that ledge. Because I don't want, I've seen one muskie, a large 51, 52-inch muskie on the St. Lawrence that I think was actually suffering from barotrauma, and we couldn't revive it. It was up at the surface. Beautiful fish, but so they can experience that for sure. I think that yes, it is likely that the odds of catching a fish and it experiencing barotrauma, if captured from like 30 feet and greater, probably increases for that fish. What's interesting is the discussion about, well, what if you're open water fishing, you're tossing, a bucktail or a bulldog or a swim bait, and thing's only going 8 feet down, but you're fishing over 60 feet of water, and a fish comes up and crushes your bait, 8 to 4 feet below the surface. What are the ethics of that? Right? I've seen that discussion online, because now are you catching a fish that was 50 feet down in gin clear water and saw your bait way up there and shot up? I mean, it wouldn't take very much for a muskie to shoot up and crush a bait from 50 feet down, and 4 feet under the surface. Or was that muskie suspended at only 10 feet below the surface, and it really didn't have to move very far to hit your bait? I think those are discussions that we can't answer in this podcast. Those are sort of, I think, personal decisions that people have to make. But I think it's entirely possible that, fish can experience barotrauma, muskies can experience barotrauma in, a variety of water depths. But I think, again, that increase is probably somewhere around 30 feet. I know personally, I just get twitchy around 30 feet. And so it's kind of my own personal cutoff there.
Yeah. And I think we kind of see that in our area. In Northwestern Ontario, our deep shield lakes, a lot of fishing is done over open water, not open water, but sitting off of structure. Fish are suspended on those deeper breaks. And that's something that a lot of people that come up here struggle with, is just quote unquote fishing deeper, having your boat over 45 feet of water and casting up to, anywhere from 8 to 25. I talk about it a lot on our channel. I think we're kind of with you there, Sean, that 25, 30 feet for the summer, we're pretty comfortable if we see fish, at 30 feet and they come up and hit a tube at 20. I'm pretty comfortable with that. In the fall, we might see fish a little bit deeper if we're getting into sucker rig season here right away. A lot of times on some of these deep lakes, we'll see the fish down in 35, 40 feet of water with whitefish pushed up against, a shoal or something. Those fish are catchable in our area when the water temps are down, 50 degrees. So again, it's kind of user beware on what you do, but the muskie industry has these hard lines in the sand on you can't do this, you can't do that. And as an industry, we're bad with pointing the finger. And for new anglers, it's always tough because you get an acclaimed muskie angler who tells you how to do things one way, whether it was his approach or he was taught it from somebody else. And some of those things end up being almost gospel in the industry, and people feel bad. If I catch a fish in 30 feet of water, I post it as such. I don't try to hide any of that. And for the most part, we don't get a lot of backlash on it, but there is that predominant thing in the industry where there's these hard and fast rules, and the warm water one is another one. And I don't want to keep you all day, Sean, because I do know you got another meeting coming up, but if we could just, I don't want to say quickly talk on the warm water thing, but where is the science on warm water and the effects on fish like muskie and pike?
Yeah, and I'll just to finish one last thought on the barotrauma thing. There's really no science on it in muskies, so that's the reality of it. So anyone that's like, I know this for fact, well, scientifically, we'd have never answered that question with muskies. So just a caveat there to point out to your listeners, we don't have any science on this with muskies in particular. Now, with warm water mortality, we now do. Some of my work from 2011 up in this area, we looked at the effectiveness of kind of current standard handling procedures used by specialized anglers and their impact on muskies. Long story short, excellent. As a community, the muskie community has developed really robust handling practices for muskies. The caveat to that work from the early 2010s was that we weren't able to angle in warm water. I think the highest we angled, the highest temperature we had angled the muskie in was like 26 Celsius, so just under 80 degrees, so high 70s. Some of my colleagues, including Derek Crane, big muskie angler down at Coastal Carolina University, some folks from West Virginia University, wanted to better address the issue of warm water mortality through a series of studies, 3 of them, including two done like in natural field settings, and then one that was done in a more controlled research pond environment. The moral of the story, to make a very long story short, is that fishing in warm water, and they were defining that as kind of anything above 25, can increase the likelihood of mortality. That's not surprising. Our own work from the early 2010s showed that, right? So we showed that if you hold a fish out of water when it's warmer water, their stress levels are significantly different than they are from individuals that are not exposed to air, for example, or significantly different than at other temperatures. So that wasn't a surprise. Now there's some caveats to their work, right? And they did these 3 studies, tons of field work. I had an opportunity to talk to the grad students that were involved in it. They did an amazing job, and but there's nuance to the findings. So again, there's increased risk of mortality. One of the nuances, one of the caveats, is that if fish have access to cooler water, thermal refugia, we call it, the risk of mortality likely decreases. So they did a study on Stonewall Jackson Reservoir in the States, Ohio, I think, West Virginia, one of those 2, I think. And they found that there was lower mortality in that particular study than there was in the pond study and the James River study. The main difference among those is that Stonewall Jackson has a thermocline. It layers up temperature-wise in the summer, and there's cooler, oxygen-rich water that fish can descend down to recover. In those research ponds, they don't stratify. It's the same temperature from top to bottom. And the James River is really quite a unique fishery because it's a very shallow river. I mean, some of the top anglers on the James River run jet boats because it's so shallow. To access some of these areas, you're talking about having to shoot through like 12 inches of water. Those researchers found that in the summer, you've got these little tributaries that come in with cold water, and fish would stack up in front of those tributaries, those little creeks, those cold water creeks coming in, and shove their face into that cold water, but they wouldn't move for a bait. Okay, they would, because they were radio tracking these fish to these locations and casting at them to try and catch them, literally like bouncing lures off their heads, and the fish wouldn't move. So that speaks to the other nuance here, which is that the available population that is catchable to anglers is substantially smaller during these warm water periods. Okay, so take your entire population of muskies. Okay, now you've got a certain subset of that entire population may be vulnerable to angling at any given time. That could be for a variety of factors. Fish just not willing to eat, or is in such deep water that anglers aren't going to target them there. So you've got whole population, now you've got a smaller chunk of the pie. Now you get into summer when temperatures are above 80 Fahrenheit, water temperatures, and you now take this chunk of the pie and you substantially reduce it to a much smaller population that is actually vulnerable to angling, actually catchable at that time period. And that's because this time, when they're in these warm water periods, the fish are having to work harder to just maintain their bodies. So they're going to be less willing to expend a lot of extraneous energy chasing bait down. They're just sitting there trying to endure. And that's why, like, the other kind of caveat to this conversation, or the other nuance to this conversation, is this whole discussion, I think, becomes more relevant to some people to have and less relevant to others. Because one of the other things that the researchers found that seemed to be a strong predictor of mortality was the amount of exposure to high water temperatures that a fish had preceding, so leading up to the actual capture event, and then what they experienced during that recovery period or after the capture event. So in other words, if a fish is caught at 85 degrees, and 2 or 3 days leading up to that, it's 85 degrees, and 2 or 3 days beyond that, it's 85 degrees. That's a substantial amount of warm water that fish is having to deal with. If you catch a fish at 81 degrees, but 3 days before, those temperatures were mid-70s, just so happened to get a freak spike in, just a heat wave, and those temperatures spiked, you catch that fish at the peak of those temperatures of that heat wave at 81 degrees surface temp, then the next 3 days, those temperatures fall back down to 77. The amount of heat that fish had to experience over the course of that same time period is much less, right? So again, there's a nuance here. For those folks fishing Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, this discussion may be really relevant to them, because those fish are going to experience warmer water temperatures for a long time. Now, up here in Southern Ontario, we definitely get 80 plus degree temperatures, every summer. And that seems to have changed from when I was doing my research in the early 2010s, late 2000s. But it's going to be a much shorter time period than it would be for fish in Kentucky. And it would be the same for Northwest Ontario. I mean, I remember in 2006, the first 50-incher I ever caught, 51-incher caught on an orange 10-inch Suick on a rock reef in Lake of the Woods, and the water temperature was like 81, 82. Okay, my dad and I didn't just drive 16 hours from central Illinois to get to Lake of the Woods, find out the water temperature is just a little above 80, and then not fish the lake. It's just not going to happen. So, you know, I know there's a lot of discussion about stop fishing at 80, stop fishing at 80. My feeling is a lot of those same anglers are going to spend close to 10 grand to go up to, you know, Annie Meyer's Lodge or something. I don't know actually how much it costs to be there, but they're going to spend a lot of money to go up to Northwest Ontario. And if those water temperatures are 80, 81 degrees, and it's looking like, you know, there's not going to be much dip in air temperatures for the next week, I got to think those anglers are probably going to continue fishing for them. And the reality is, it's probably okay. However, okay, and I want all the listeners to listen to me when I say this, you cannot treat a muskie caught at temperatures above 80 degrees Fahrenheit the same way you would at 65 or 70, okay? You're going to need to expedite everything about your handling of that fish. That includes maybe not taking a picture out of water, because that is the single most stressful thing that we can do for a fish, aside from actually like hooking them. But when we're handling them, okay, pulling them out of the water, that is the single most stressful thing you can do for them. So you cannot expect to hold a fish out of the water for 30 seconds, you know, at 82, 83 degree water temperatures and expect the same outcome as you would for a fish, you know, caught at 65. It's possible. It's possible that fish would be just fine. In fact, in probably a lot of cases, it's probably going to be all right. It might, however, cause that fish to be pushed past the point of no return. So I would just like encourage people that, you know, if you're going to fish at temperatures above 80 Fahrenheit, you really just need to behave differently as an angler than you would at any other time. And you were talking earlier about, you know, sort of some of the cultural things in the muskie community, and you know, there's like certain things that people claim are like gospel. Some of the discussion about fishing in warm water has gotten to the point where it's just a little bizarre. And I think it comes from a good place, but I don't think in the long run it's really helpful for the muskie community, for, you know, encouraging new anglers to like come into the sport who might not have as much, you know, experience with these fish. And I think there's not enough discussion about some of these key nuances. And I think I would encourage, you know, viewers and listeners of this to really think a little bit more nuanced about this topic, and that it's not just you hit 80, everyone has to stop fishing for them. If you want to do it, go ahead. But I think there's a way that you can still fish for muskies above 80 in some places and it still be okay. But again, you as the angler also have to change your behavior too.
Yeah, that's probably the single biggest takeaway I'll take from this, you know, talk or interview, is that we see it as it's a case by case basis. And I will say one thing about the fish handling, and it goes back to the culture of musky fishing. We're in this grip and grin world where everybody's trying to catch that muskie and post that picture and get the likes and the views. I mean, I'm no different. I have a YouTube channel. That's what we're doing here. But we personally, all I can do is try to handle the fish as best we can, get it back in a timely manner. And when the water's too warm, we either have to make that decision that we're not going to go fishing that day, or maybe we don't get that grip and grin. Maybe it's just out of the net, quickly back in. We haven't really bumped a fish all year. We've been using just the floating measure stick in the net. It's a rough measurement, but I can get that data for Muskies Canada. It's going to be close enough. It's little things that we can do. And I do think that the industry needs to do a better job of self-policing, self-regulating, and not pointing the finger. When guides from St. Clair, wherever it is, are telling other people you can't fish because it's over 80, they're not canceling their guide trip. So as an industry, we have a problem where
Yeah.
we tell people to do something and we don't really follow through ourselves. So I'm just going to ask one question. We'll leave it there, Sean, because I know you got some stuff to do, and I truly, again,
This is
appreciate your
way more
time.
fun than what I have planned after this. So.
Sounds like it. And I hope to, and I'm sure my viewers are going to be like, bring Sean back on. Let's talk about some other stuff. So maybe we can do that. But going back to those studies about mortality, one of the other subjects that come up a lot is just across the board delayed mortality. It's a number people throw around as a percentage. In is there any data that shows on average if 100 fish get caught in a lake, doesn't, regardless of the angler experience, from beginner to the best guide on the lake, is there a percentage of what we could expect as delayed mortality based on science?
The short answer is we don't really have that. So the caveat to that though is that, you know, part of my work that was published in the early 2010s, we did radio tag a total of 30 muskies. 15 of those were, you know, fish that were held out of the water. 15 were not air exposed, in an effort to try and estimate mortality. We didn't have any of those fish die, you know, again, up to about 25, 26 Celsius water temperatures. So, you know, again, like mid 70s. The conclusion that we put into that paper was that mortality is probably negligible. Now, what negligible equates to as a percentage, I don't know. Let's say it's 5%. You know, you know, I think that it could be. It's probably below 10%, but honestly, Glenn, I would just be speculating as to what that would be. But I think it's pretty negligible. You know, but again, like, if you are catching 100, you know, a couple hundred, you know, if you're a guide, say for example, like if you're catching that number of fish and you don't necessarily notice any immediate mortality, that is like the fish dies on the surface in your hands, it's likely that some of those fish that succumbed, you just weren't there to witness that. But what that actual number is, I couldn't tell you offhand. Yeah.
No, and I think our personal experience on that, for David and myself and the others real close to me that fish, we've killed 2 muskies in all our angling that we know of. One was a deeply hooked fish in the gills. We couldn't do anything about it. And the other one swallowed a swimming dog in past the throat, and we couldn't extract it. And again, you feel horrible as a musky angler, but those things are going to happen. I'll just leave it with this question or this thought. When we always talk about throwing these huge trebles in a muskie's face, and yeah, there's damage on the outside of the head that is inevitable. We can't control that. But when a fish is just naturally hooked in the corner of the mouth or the top of the lip versus a 50-inch muskie eating an 18-inch walleye with those big, sharp dorsal fins, how different is that to a muskie, do you think? Like, how, outside of the being pulled out of the water, how different is that bony walleye or that bony crappie in the muskie's mouth versus just getting a treble? Like, just your thoughts on it. I know there's no science, but what would a scientist say the difference is there? Because I have to think that bony crappie or walleye going down the throat of a muskie's got to be a horrible experience. That's just my thoughts.
Well, certainly if it's positioned incorrectly. I mean, I can tell you that the handling a crappie or walleye especially, geez, the spiny dorsal fin feels just like jabbing myself with a hook. Yes. So, you know, to me, there's, you know, almost no difference in terms of how you know, comfortable that feels. I would, you know, presume that with fish that, yeah, there's, they're getting poked by these giant spines on an 18-inch walleye, or even, a big perch has similarly sized spines on their dorsal fin. My sense from watching like videos of muskies and pike actually consuming prey, some of them strike from behind, right? And I think if they can engulf the fish fast enough, the prey fish won't have time to throw its dorsal fin up. But others that come in and T-bone from the side will then work the fish so its head is going down. As its head goes down, then the muskie's mouth will be able to collapse the dorsal fin. So then it should be such that the dorsal fins aren't like poking its its esophagus as it's like working its way down into the stomach. But I'm sure to a muskie getting jabbed in the mouth by a spiny ray fin fish would be a deeply unpleasant experience, which is probably in part why where they have access to lots of suckers, they like eating suckers. They'll eat lots of perch too, but a sucker or a Cisco is going to be a lot easier to eat than something like a walleye or a yellow perch. And just for the record, like, muskies really don't eat walleyes. Okay, we've laid that misconception to bed a long time ago, despite what some groups would like us to believe, or would like the public to believe. Muskies really don't target walleye. They'll eat them at maybe opportunistically, but they'll also eat a coot opportunistically if presented with one, or something else, right? Muskrat. So yeah, I don't think if anyone's ever asked that, but yeah, touching a walleye spine the wrong way is the same as grabbing a treble hook out of your tackle box and jabbing your thumb with that. So deeply unpleasant.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the talk, and I'm going to reach out off the air and see if I can get a little bit of your research stuff that I can maybe put some links to, if any of that's publicly available, Sean, because I think a lot of our viewers will appreciate your work. I truly appreciate your work. And the more I get to know of your work, the more I've kind of dug into it. So on behalf of all of our viewers, I just truly want to say thank you. And I hope to do this again in the future.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I know we had some things sort of on the agenda that we didn't get to. So I'm happy to come back and chat again with you, Glenn.
Awesome. Appreciate it. You enjoy the rest of your day. I'm sure it's going to be a little less fun on your next meeting.
Definitely.
And
Definitely.
we'll touch back with you soon. So for 54 Bus, I just want to say thank you.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. Take care.